Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here. My name's Tom DeFalco, and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. Our next Evolution of Sport speaker is Tyler Oberle, and he is the Director of Football Analytics at the Sideline View. His talk is called Elitics Model, NFL Player Efficiency Rating Metric. This talk is going to go until about 1:25. It'll be 20 minutes of presentation, and then we'll leave 5 minutes for questions at the end. If you have questions, please try to come to the middle aisle so that we can get you the mic. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tyler.
Well, I'm excited about the opportunity to be able to speak with you all today, up against a tough time slot, competing against the commish. But the really exciting part, though, is who I'm talking to today. You who are in the class, we're crazy about football, specifically the NFL, or college football for that matter. So this is the audience that I want to talk with. Today I'm going to be introducing player efficiency rating. Some of you have been familiar with it, maybe heard of it from what John Hollinger put together in the NBA. Very similar in the overall goal, but the approach, and obviously with it being a completely different sport, we're going to dive into it into pretty good detail. Now, I will preface to say, first thing, within this competition, basically a time slot, I don't have a whole lot of time to be able to dive into the nitty-gritty and the background type information. So my focus today is more on the implementation and utilization, and how a team can take this information, utilize it within their own front office. If you would like more information to actually kind of look at the background of the calculations, some of my background research, if you go to scribd.com, scribd.com, do a document search for Elitics model, and you'll be able to download and access that. And then my Twitter handle is @TylerOberle. Would love to get you guys' feedback, thoughts, impressions, questions, whatever you want to do. So let's dive into it and really get after it, basically. What's the overall goal of the player efficiency rating? Earlier in the football analytics class this morning, one thing that you hear a lot of people say, and even Nate Silver wrote about it in the new ESPN The Magazine article, is in football we don't necessarily have a true way to measure every player on the field at the same time with one metric. And the overall goal within analytics isn't always to answer specific questions, but sometimes to actually ask more questions, or answer specific questions, but actually ask more questions. So one of the questions I had was, okay, we always talk about the quarterback position. How valuable is the quarterback, and how much more valuable is the quarterback compared to a defensive tackle, for example? Is there a way to quantify that, both performance and as far as value? And so I've established the player efficiency rating. The overall goal of the player efficiency rating is we introduce one metric for all positions throughout the entire NFL. The biggest thing about PER does not look directly at a player's gross output. It actually cares more about the process So today we're going to break it down into three main sections as far as review. The first section, we're going to look at the individual position. Of course, the quarterback is the sexy position, and that's what everyone wants to talk about. So we'll dive into that and actually look at that. And then we'll actually look at a team and roster breakout as far as the development of a team as measured by PER, where we can look at it for roster depth and roster construction. And then the last thing, which I feel has immediate impact for a team, especially given where we're at in the schedule of the NFL leading up to the draft, we're going to dive into rookie projections and how the PER, because now we have comparative analysis, one metric for all positions, we can start to establish a more analytically based big board. So let's look at it. In order to calculate PER, first thing we have to do is we have to come up with a contribution. And of course, at every single position, it's very different. Obviously, a defensive tackle, statistically, is a lot different than a quarterback. So each contributions have to be measured and have to be calculated individually first. Specifically for the quarterback, and in my background research, I actually write about why the contributions are chosen. But for example, on the actual process-oriented, so as opposed to total touchdowns that Peyton Manning threw, which is a great statistic, broke the NFL record this last year and all of that, we actually care more about the touchdown percentage. What percentage of his overall throws were converted to touchdowns? Likewise, on a negative type contribution to the overall number would be interception percentage. When Thomas Dimitroff and Coach Smith were talking about Matt Ryan in the process of drafting Matt Ryan, one thing they talked about was the 19 interceptions. Well, 19 interceptions, when you look at that, doesn't sound like a good number, but when you break it down even deeper to say, okay, 19 interceptions over 625 throws is actually a 3% interception percentage. 3% of his throws are interceptions. You get a lot better understanding of the actual process of passing. And if you look at elite quarterbacks in the NFL, they typically throw 3% or less as far as interception rating. So the PER scale, how is this actually scaled and presented? I decided to go ahead and do a 1.0 scale, and there's a couple main reasons why we did that, and we'll obviously dive into it and look at it. But the first reason is the overall average player in the NFL is built on a 1.0 scale. The average player in the NFL is a 1, okay? And that's was the original basis of building. The second reason behind it is not only was I looking to calculate player performance, but also true player value. Of course, we pay Peyton Manning $17.5 million, but is he worth it? Is there a way to calculate that? What's his true value? And so that's the second reason why I chose a 1.0 scale as opposed to a plus minus or anything like that, is so we can actually calculate it directly against a cap. So looking at the individual, this is the actual quarterback position. These are the top 10 players in this last season, 2013 season in the NFL. If we look at the top 10, I think if we asked every single person in here, list out who you believe were the top 10 players in the NFL, and then we tallied it all, posted it up on a graph, I believe the majority of everyone in this room, this list would basically be about these cast of characters would be up on the board. The main one that might stand out to a lot of people would be Josh McCown. Obviously, he only had 4 or 5 games worth of data that we could go off of, so I had to project where he would be at in 16 games. Of course, you can say, well, Josh McCown's numbers might be lower over a 16-game projection. I had to take that into account and calculate, but his efficiency while he was playing was so high that it still warranted him to be in the top 10 in PER. The other glaring thing to really notice, let's look at it from a value perspective. Look at the cap hit. And what you can see as far as cap hit, when you look at Peyton Manning compared to Nick Foles, this is such a glaring difference on the rookie wage scale. And obviously, when people talk about why it's so important to draft well, this is the example. If you look at Russell Wilson and where he's at on salary compared to Tony Romo, who's the next closest as far as a veteran QB, let's exclude Josh McCown from this discussion. You know, it's over $11 million difference in cap. And this last week, we saw the Eagles have all these restructured deals for their entire offensive line, re-signing their receivers, in large part because of Nick Foles and the performance of what he's had this last year. You can now kind of get a better understanding or idea as to why the Eagles have that flexibility compared to maybe, let's say, the Falcons and what they did with Matt Ryan's long extension last year. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's what we want to dive into as far as value. So let's look at Peyton Manning, and let's put this fully in perspective. So Peyton Manning had a PER score of 2.72. The average player in the entire NFL is a 1. Peyton actually had the best score of all players in the NFL this last year. Matter of fact, going back and reviewing long-term, even the John Elways, the Dan Marinos in past, Peyton Manning's PER rating, player efficiency rating, was the highest ever by a quarterback recorded. And that obviously, with the record-setting season that he had this year, that number backs it up. But let's look at it from a value perspective. Looking at Peyton Manning compared to Aaron Rodgers, there's a difference in $5.5 million of actual cap money that was spent between the players. But if you look at value, and the value is basically just taking their cap number divided by their PER score, you can see that Peyton Manning and Aaron Rodgers, as far as true value, are essentially at the same level. And this is where you go into the level of, okay, paying Peyton Manning $17.5 million, is it worth it? Well, to the Broncos, if Peyton Manning plays the way that he's playing right now, yes, it's worth it when you put it in that perspective. Even looking at Peyton's cap value compared to, let's say, for example, Tom Brady or Ben Roethlisberger, who are getting paid about $4 million less this last year. Peyton's value per performance was better than Tom Brady or Ben Roethlisberger. Let's look at it from an actual view of the NFL roster. So what this visual, and I love this visual, is actually every single NFL team, every player on the 53-man roster, built in, basically reviewing the roster on an average basis. So this is the average PER level for each team. If you look at the top 4 teams, one thing to notice, the top 4 teams in PER were actually the final 4 in the NFL in the playoffs. Obviously, at the complete bottom, you see the Jaguars, who are in quite a rebuild, restructure, process. And that just gives you a perspective on where they're at as far as depth and top to bottom in their overall roster construction. We'll look at that in the next slide as well. But the biggest thing, and this is without injuries, okay? This is as if every player is healthy throughout the entire season. This is what this model is built on. When the Patriots went into, of course, this fluctuates on a week-to-week basis. This fluctuates. When the Patriots went into the playoffs, they were sitting roughly right where the Bills were, slightly above a 1. And considering the enormous amount of injuries that the Patriots had at the end of the regular season, to still carry an average player efficiency rating as a team above a 1, and that's your goal. Obviously, you want to be above a 1, above the league average. That gives some perspective on how deep their actual roster was. And we'll talk about one of their key players, a couple rookies that they had that really helped. A little bit of formatting issues with this slide, but if we look at, so this is the difference between the top and the bottom of the league as far as PER this last year, the Patriots. And you can see the actual breakout of each individual position across the board. The dotted line is the average 1.0 scale. A couple things I really want to point out. Obviously, you see the Patriots are sitting very well across the board. The defensive line had some depth issues, and the overall roster projected PER. And then obviously the Aaron Hernandez situation didn't help as far as depth in the tight end position. So when Gronkowski went down, it wasn't surprising, and the PER showed this, that there wasn't much depth behind that in case something happened. But the most glaring thing that this chart really points out is the value of an elite quarterback. And if you see Tom Brady at a 2.12 score, you can just see light years as far as graphically from a perspective how important it is in player efficiency rating and what an elite quarterback can do to your team. And that was something that was discussed earlier this morning in the football analytics class. So let's conclude in the last part, and obviously I want to get into questions and let's get the flow back and forth. But this to me is the most critical part of the player efficiency rating, where I believe can have immediate impact. This draft class will be the 4th overall draft class that I've been able to establish. And so because with PER, now we have comparative analysis. We can look at defensive tackles, quarterbacks, running backs, offensive line on that 1.0 scale building. We can actually look and develop an entire big board based on the PER rating. In the draft class that Russell Wilson was in a couple of years ago, he actually was the highest player of PER, projected PER for the NFL. And matter of fact, even going back and looking at the John Elway's, he was in the class with Andrew Luck even, Russell had the highest PER score that's ever been calculated by a college quarterback. And I've went back to 99, I've went back, but then I also, just to take it even further, curious where's John Elway sit and all of that. John Elway was at like a 1.94. So Russell Wilson was at a 2.03. His actual performance, his rookie year, was a 2.15. And then also, looking at the top 10 a little bit earlier, Russell has been a top 10 quarterback in player efficiency. Now, you might argue to me, Tyler, Russell isn't necessarily a better passer. He didn't have all these passing yards or whatever this last year. I don't dispute passing yards, but again, how important is passing yards? How much more important is player efficiency, converting on third downs? And that's something that Russell showed throughout the entire playoffs and leading the Seahawks to a Super Bowl win. This last year's draft class was frankly, a very goofy class. The lack of quarterback strength really pushed a lot of defensive players to the top. And Logan Ryan was the top defensive player projected on the PER, my PER big board. Frankly, I was very skeptical of my own model. I didn't know a lot about Logan Ryan. I'm from the Midwest. I'm an Ohio guy. And so Logan Ryan being from Rutgers, didn't watch a lot of Rutgers football. Maybe we will now that they're in the Big Ten. But his projected PER was a 1.77. If you can look at that, where Russell Wilson was, obviously last year's draft class was lower on average. And so, this projected him towards the top. But his rookie projection, he didn't play all 16 games. He only played in 11 games. But projecting as if he did play all 16 games and his performance on the field, he would have scored a 2.15, or that was his score, 2.15 this last year as well. Coincidentally, it's the same as Russell Wilson. I did not attempt to do it that way at all. But backing that, so this is from advancednflstats.com website. If you look at EPA, this is sorted by EPA per game. These are all cornerbacks, EPA per game. And Logan is highlighted there in the yellow. He is the highest rated rookie cornerback in EPA per game, calculating 2.36 points per game estimated by advancednflstats.com. So even higher than Trufant, even higher than Xavier Rhodes from Minnesota. And that was a critical thing for me, just to get a little bit of alternative feedback, I guess, and that was something that I was looking into. Always bounce off other people's ideas on where their projection and rating systems are. In conclusion, to conclude this overall presentation, I believe the player efficiency rating and the Elitics model can reveal, quantify, and communicate performance by providing comparative analysis as calculated with this player efficiency rating. And as shown in this presentation, I believe the PR metric is an added dimension that can guide a team in separating themselves from the rest of the NFL. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Hi, I noticed that in your per team listing there, where you had all 32 teams, that in the NFC East, you had the Redskins at the absolute top. I'm just wondering if there was if you could give us some background on like how you calculated these roster level ratings and any intuition as to why the Redskins might have come out on top there.
So why were the Redskins, for example, a little higher than maybe the Eagles, who won the division? What we do is see how we have this breakout. Each of these is averaged based on each individual position. So your defensive backs is the defensive back core. If we want to get even further as far as specifics of cornerback, safeties, we can do that. But just to save on the slide, I did defensive backs, linebackers, defensive line. So looking at a top to bottom, as far as average, that's where the Redskins, and I don't have the graph where I could pull up the Redskins and the Eagles off the top, but the overall would be when you have players like a D'Angelo Hall, which I know gets a lot of rap in this community, but he had statistically, when you go back and look at it, one of his best seasons. And I know that Aaron Schatz isn't a big fan of him, but then also Arakpo having the year he did. When you look at the top to bottom of where the team was as a whole, they had more basically in PER breakout than where the Eagles were.
I just noticed on your quarterback, you had game-winning drives on there, which is a cumulative stat, and all the other stats you had there were rate stats. How do you plug that in with the difference? And then also, I guess for passing and really for everything, but do you adjust for era? Because, when you go back and look at John Elway, it's a lot harder to pass in 1982 than it is right now.
Right, so especially on some of the statistics that I had to use, for example, passing yards, to get or yards per attempt as opposed to air yards. I would rather choose air yards, but within my model right now, it is utilizing, for example, yards per attempt. The game-winning drive is just a very fraction, but really what it's looking for is fourth quarter performance, like what we talked about earlier as far as clutch. Is there any way to look at a quarterback, for example, Andrew Luck, and is there any meaning behind him having the late fourth quarter drives, and should that be contributed within the player efficiency rating. Like I wrote in my background paper, it is a fractional addition as far as a positive contribution, but it is a contribution that I felt should be included. The nice thing about this, especially in an implementation with a team, and I have done some work with teams individually, you can actually work with them and get an understanding of what they specifically value more or less, and can rerun the equation and adjust towards what their strengths or their viewpoint is, essentially. But like I wrote in my research paper, obviously I know don't have a whole lot of time to be able to dive into that. I go into a lot more detail as to why I chose those specific elements. Go ahead.
Here, I got the mic. On your per team PR rating, it seems that the average of the league is below 1.0.
Slightly below. It's
How do you
actually
explain that?
0.97 is where it's at. When you look at the full adjustment in this last year, it was just slightly below, as the average was about a 0.978, so basically a 0.98. And where I've built this, this was over the last year, but looking and the way I have it built is going all the way back to 2004 data, so it's all pulled from 2004 on. And so last year might have overall been at like a 0.978, 0.98 essentially, which was slightly lower than the league average, but the actual calculations and the projection is all built on that 1.0 scale.
I have a question about the money, the revenue.
Yeah.
You had Peyton Manning at a salary of $17 million, and then there was a column of $13 million. I don't remember the exact, but does that mean oh no, I'm sorry, it was less than that, value $6.433 million. Does that mean he contributed that much revenue to the team? What does that number mean?
This is all based on true value as it looks to performance, so value and performance. The average player in the NFL is a 1.0, and the average cap in 2013 was 2.2. So the average overall value per player was $2.2 million. And then to actually get into a deeper perspective, when you want to start to calculate, okay, how high do we want to pay Peyton Manning? That's where you can start to get into, okay, the average quarterback was near $4 million. So if I look at value and Peyton's let's take $4 million, which is the average cap number of the last year, times 2.72, I now have an actual idea on his true value. So 4 times 2.72 is a little over 8. And you can see where he's at as compared to the average quarterback in the NFL on cap. So, no. So this is measuring true value. And what this is looking at is on to bring the actual value to a balanced scale across each position. The weight that I've attributed to the scale is something that I didn't weigh in. It's used based on just where the teams place the value, so the actual cap numbers in the overall chart that I just showed here. So, for example, the quarterback position, and it's basic economics, supply and demand. So a quarterback, obviously there's a lot less quality quarterbacks, but then also the amount of money you pay on them is a lot higher. And across the board, so the quarterback position, everything gets scaled to 1, but then it gets weighted to value. And specifically, I've decided to attribute the weight based on where the teams place their priority as far as cap numbers.
Okay, thanks. So winning quarterback is one element of it. Coach is the second element of it. Can this be expanded to rate coaches, especially at different positions? Because that might explain why the Redskins
Yeah, it
are
can.
high.
It'd be an interesting on the contribution side, what you would use to actually get to the full calculation. If you want to look at the difference between actual wins and Pythagorean wins or projected wins, you could get to something along those lines and then put an actual coach's score together. But for this specific, my entire mindset is behind roster build, front office management, cap management, and rookie evaluations. So that was kind of where I've focused my research.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you, Tyler, for the presentation.
Thank you.
And feel free to ask questions afterwards.